The story I'm about to give is outrageous. Now, I know immediately when I say outrageous, the little thing in my head says, well, outrageous according to what? Anything outrageous is going to be relative. Relative to what standard am I talking about? From the standpoint of Western democracies, we have this notion of a free press. By a standard that looks at this and says Western democracies has a free press, this is an outrageous story. And I'm going to recount this coming up on the soapbox. And by the way, this is not in the United States, but it might as well be in the United States. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. And behind me, what you're seeing is Julian Assange being taken out of the embassy. Assange had been in the embassy for 7 years. 7 years. Now, people often forget what he was in the embassy for because he's been in the embassy for so long. Now, the video that Bradley Manning put out.
Now we got a few birds. We're still firing.
What's this? This is why, at least the charges, the 18 charges that they've put on him, this is what they pertain to.
Roger. Got him.
6, this is 2-6. We'll move, but we got 13.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, it's
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle. Sorry. I hit my head.
I'm going to stop this before this gets too far into it. Because what this video shows is essentially Reuters agents being killed. The copter, the pilot, had no idea what he was shooting at, and yet he was shooting nonetheless. And all of the people that were down there, all of those people were innocent, were massacred. Now, Chelsea Manning gave this information to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks published this information. Right now, he's in prison. And well, let's call it jail, while they squeeze him to try to get him to flip on Julian Assange, who they are currently trying to get extradited to the United States or Sweden, which I strongly suspect would still end up being the United States. That's astonishing because what they're going after him for is publishing. All of these publishers in the United States, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, Rachel Maddow, Chuck Todd, all of these guys who don't necessarily like Julian Assange because in their minds he got Hillary Clinton elected, but they don't particularly like him, still come on and says, whoa, you're going too far. You're going after publishing itself. Now the government is just saying, be nice. If you be nice, there's nothing to see here. Everything is okay. There's nothing wrong. We're not shaking anybody down. The world is great. But they understand what's taking place. This is an eating away of the First Amendment. This is a whack, an outright attack, a broadside on the First Amendment. And so all of them have stood on the line, even though they dislike Julian Assange, they felt like they're compelled to do so. That's not just here in the United States. What you're watching, is the same thing happening in Australia. This is the cops going into ABC News, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, corporation. What they're doing is they're looking for fouls for one of the broadcasters. One of the broadcasters, in fact, like 3, to be specific, 3 journalists were giving information. 2 reporters, one director was given information that's been known as the Afghan files. Now, these Afghan files essentially were kind of like our own files of special forces, where these guys are killing kids and civilians, essentially children in some cases men, but essentially killing people that shouldn't be killed. But it goes further into, it reports on this kind of culture that's created, this warrior culture that's created. Here's the thing though, how do you expect them to act? This is my criticism of the military thing. This notion that we protect the troops or we support the troops by somehow supporting them in their military engagements. We support the troops by keeping their ass at home. The moment that you put a human being into conditions like that, there are certain things that are going to take place, certain processes that are just specific to the environment. If you have these guys in these high pressure situations where they're out there literally whacking people for the government, they're still whacking people nonetheless. What do you think? How do you think they're going to behave? Do you honestly think they're going to be businessmen as they go out and whack other people. The reports, to some degree, are a no shit. The part of it that gets disconcerting is the killings. You can read the documents for yourself. I'm going to link them in the video itself. Right here, Afghan files. They went through 9,214 documents, one by one. Many of these things were emails. And understand what that means. If you were a whistleblower, they were contacting some of the reporters at this organization and you were talking to them about things that had nothing to do with this. The government has just pulled open your files potentially and looked at stuff that might not have been pertinent to anything that they were looking at. They were looking through all of these files. There's sensitive information associated with the way the media interacts with whistleblowers. That's assuming they're interacting with whistleblowers, and in this particular case, they were. But understand what that means. Think about the chilling effect that it puts on people who may witness stuff. This is grisly stuff that is being discussed behind the scenes, that is not being made available to the public, meaning the public doesn't get a choice in what the military of that country is doing. How on earth do you keep control of your government when you have no idea what your government is doing? This stuff is taking place in the shadows. And I understand this notion of national security, but it's often invoked to hide stuff, not necessarily to protect stuff that's vital to national security. I would argue that it is vital to national security interests to know that we are whacking and killing civilians, that the people who we're putting out there, that we know they're doing these things. And these guys are not, it even makes a point in the report that there's a culture of looking past infractions. But of course they're going to look past infractions. It's going to be like cop culture. Oh, these guys are doing a difficult job. It's high pressure. It's high stress. You don't understand the pressure that we have to go through. I mean, look how pumped we are. I mean, we're whacking people. You don't get it. So yeah, why would they be all that into going after? My point is, it's a systemic change that takes place the moment that you're going to put somebody in that very specific situation. So we should venture not to put people in these situations. But the report just kind of gives this notion of, look, we've been doing grisly things in the shadows. This is kind of like our own special forces. If you remember, that report was released through WikiLeaks. That is essentially saying the exact same thing. This is not an issue of the individual per se. This is a systemic change that happens to the individual once you put them into these high pressure situations where they're out there killing people. I'm going to link all of these to the bottom. By the way, this was released by this gentleman. Defense official. A former Defense Force lawyer has been charged with releasing classified material to 3 high-profile journalists. David McBride is facing charges over the release of material related to the alleged misconduct of Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. Misconduct is an understatement. But his point is, look, you guys know I released this information. And yes, I did release it to these journalists. And yes, this is something that we need to talk about in court. His point is, I am not afraid of what is going to happen or what's coming up. There's a conversation that we need to have in regards to our society that we are not having. That the only way we can have this conversation is if this stuff lands and is aired out to some degree in court. It's a fascinating perspective because to some degree he's right. Now they're making this argument that your lawyers are going to need special access and all this other stuff because of the materials. But his point is, no, I want this to be an open court. I want this to be talked about because otherwise it forever stays in the shadows. David McBride is facing charges over the release of materials related to the alleged misconduct of Afghan Special Forces in Afghanistan. The ACT Magistrates Court today said he was formally charged with giving materials to journalists Dan Oakes, Sam Clark, and Chris Masters. Mr. McBride has not entered any pleas to any charges, but outside the court said not making any bones about his revealing the events. In seeking to have his case looking pure, in seeking to have the case looking purely at whether the government broke the law and whether it was my duty as a lawyer to report the facts. That's fascinating, because think of what he's saying. The government is not supposed to be doing something that breaks the law. Otherwise, what's the point of the law if the government is going to go ahead and break the law? The government is, yes, the law enforcer in this case, but it's also it's like God and Jesus. It's both at the same time. And he's saying, look, I released this information, but if you find that the government was breaking the law, then my release of this information is valid as a whistleblower. So yes, it is my duty as a lawyer to release this information because the government is breaking the law. The government is not supposed to be doing something that breaks the law. Ergo, it is my duty to release this information. Now, this perspective is awesome because not many people will put themselves on the line in this way. The reason I was showing the Assange video is because Assange had been in that embassy for 7 years for being a publisher. And this guy's saying, look, yes, let's go to court. I suspect he probably doesn't want to, but ultimately his fate in this case is going to depend on, and see, it may not even depend on whether or not the government was doing something illegal. This national security stuff gets a little dicey. But nevertheless, he's trying to push this into a court case. Mr. Bride said he tried internal processes within the department to bring the allegations of wrongdoing to light, but it went to the press. But it was not successful. That's when he went to the press. The government is using the smoke screen to try to stop journalists and people in Australia from finding out what actually went on, Mr. McBride said. He was arrested in Sydney airport. So apparently he was living in Spain. He comes back in for father-daughter dance at his daughter's school, and he was arrested at that point. But the journalists kept track of all this, meaning they kept a record of what the feds were doing. Oh, by the way, and one last point to this. This wasn't the only raid that took place. One of the other raids that took place had to do with the journalist's house. They went to the journalist's house and raided the woman's house. Think about what we're talking about here. Journalists are supposed to be this check on government power. And in their duty, in their job, they're supposed to have this leeway to be able to publish factually true information, which is what they were publishing. Now, Australia may be able to find some law that it's going to use, like in the United States, using the espionage law and so forth. But this is probably going to be fought over. But think of the chilling effect this has from the standpoint of people who are reporting on things that the government is doing wrong, that it has no business doing at all. These people are being arrested and locked up. Not in totalitarian states. This is not happening in Iraq, even though it may be happening in Iraq. This is happening in the U.S. for one, in Britain for another, and Australia as another. It's supposed to be the pinnacle of liberal democracies. We believe in a free press, except when they're saying things that is, not within our liking and goes contrary to our interests. This is astonishing. I mean, this is outrageous that they allowed this to take place, or that this is being allowed to take place. Absolutely astonishing. The police said Tuesday and Wednesday's raid were not connected, meaning going after the woman in her house was not connected to the raid that took place on ABC News. Both, however, relate to separate allegations of publishing classified materials contrary to provisions of the Crimes Act of 1914. They go all the way back to the war. This goes all the way back to the war. And not the Second World War, the first one. Here's a note. In times of war, countries get really dicey about the information that's put out. Any notion of internal strife creates problems with the issue of morale and problems with this notion of having a bunch of armed men that may no longer follow your orders because of internal dilemmas that have taken place in the country. Think, for example, the Russian Revolution and the Tsarist Rebellion, the Red, White Army, etc., etc. Countries pass laws that lock up or criminalize speech during that time because in their minds they have to. Think of the persecution of Eugene Debs being put in prison during World War I under Woodrow Wilson. They're using a law that goes all the way back to that date in order to go after journalists today. This is not Russia, even though it may be taking place in Russia. This is supposed to be the pinnacle of Western democracies. We believe in a free press. Again, except when it's publishing information that we find distasteful, goes against our interests. I'm going to put the Afghan files at the bottom so you can read for yourself. This is a grisly read. I was reading this earlier today, and it is a grisly read. Fathers, sons, just, casualties, civilian casualties. And again, I make this point that don't look at this from the individual aspect. Look at this from the perspective of a system that puts people into these war zone situations. And it's like, how do you expect people to behave in those situations? And what do you expect their superiors that are close to these people, how do you expect them to behave? The culture, to some degree, makes the individual, not the other way around, if that makes sense. I'll end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Again, this is a grisly read, so fair warning. Thanks all.